Alright, let's check out Brightin Star's new 35mm 1.8 autofocus lens for Sony and Nikon, which Brightin Star kindly sent me for free to test and review for you guys. So first of all, in terms of like the build quality, I think this lens has a fantastic build quality. It's pretty much entirely made of metal, which makes it feel very solid and robust, just like the 85mm 1.8 lens I've reviewed from Brightin Star in the past. If you want to watch that video, click up here. But this lens is definitely somewhat heavy and bulky for a 35mm 1.8 prime lens. It's about 400 grams, and when compared to something like the Sony or Samyang 35mm 1.8 lenses, it's definitely significantly bigger. Next, in terms of like the lens features, it has a USB-C port for firmware upgrades, a rubber gasket for weather sealing, a declicked by default smooth aperture ring without a click or declick switch, an autofocus manual focus switch, a costume function button, a very smooth focus ring with some resistance to it, so you can get like very smooth manual focus adjustments, and also a 62mm filter thread in front of the lens. Next, in terms of autofocus performance, I tested this lens with my Sony ZV-E1 and I didn't experience any autofocus issues like hunting or pulsing, unless shooting in a relatively contrasty scene or when I position myself slightly at the edge of the frame. But honestly, that's the case for most third-party Chinese cheap lenses. So if you want the absolute best autofocus performance with your Sony camera, you should definitely buy a native Sony lens. Next, when autofocusing, this lens is practically silent. You will not hear any noises from the motors and whatnot, so you can easily put like a shotgun microphone on top of your camera and it's not going to be affecting the audio basically. And then in terms of like the focus breathing performance, I think this lens performs really well. There is slight focus breathing, but it's barely noticeable. So if you're doing video focus pulling or photo focus stacking shots, this lens is definitely something worth considering. But where it definitely disappointed me is with the minimum focus distance, which is 40 centimeters. And I think it's quite far for a 35mm 1.8 lens, because for example, the Sony 35mm 1.8 has a minimum focus distance of about 23 or 25 centimeters, which means if you want to get creative and get very close to your subject, it's going to be much easier than with the Sony lens than with this Brightin Star 35mm 1.8. But not only you get a pretty far minimum focus distance, you also get a very soft image, especially when shooting wide open. So here, as you can see, I have 4 photos with different aperture settings. I have f1.8, 2.2, 2.8, and f4. And if I'm going to zoom in, I focused, by the way, here at the center. As you can see, at f1.8, it produces a very soft image. But even if I go to like the f4 image, you will still see some artifacts, if you will, like blurriness and mushiness, which makes the shot look very cheap. So basically, the image quality performance at the minimum focus distance is terrible with this lens, at least in my opinion. But let's see how it performs not at the minimum focus distance. So let me zoom in. And as you can see, it looks much better in here. Everything looks very sharp and even. And at f2.2, it definitely looks significantly sharper than at f1.8. And then at f2.8, the image in the center at least becomes pretty much sharp across, the center. And then at f4, everything is stuck sharp in the center of the frame. Let's see the corners. As you can see, you definitely get very soft corner sharpness performance, especially at f1.8, and then at f2.2 it slightly improves, but it's still somewhat blurry. At f2.8 it significantly improves, but still it is somewhat, soft. And then at f4 you get pretty much the best performance with this lens. Now let me show you the vignetting performance. As you can see, you get like a pretty heavy vignetting when shooting at f1.8, which improves at f2.2. And then at f2.8 it also looks a bit better, and at f4 there's barely honestly any vignetting in here. Let's go to the next one. Here I try to test like the chromatic aberration, and I think it performs really well. There's barely any, LoCA, chromatic aberration issues in here. Maybe a bit of magenta and red in here, but it's barely noticeable. But what I can definitely notice is that the way it transitions from like the blurry parts to the focused parts looks a bit cheap. Like this transition in here at f1.8 from here to here, which is where I focused with my camera, looks very cheap. And I think it's because I was really close to the subject. So basically I was shooting at the minimum focus distance. All right, let's say the next shot here. I wanted to show you what kind of a color cast this lens produces, and I've compared it to my Zeiss 35mm 1.4 lens. And as you can see, the Brightin Star lens definitely produces like a warm color shift, which you have to consider because this will add extra time in post-production when it comes to adjusting and correcting the white balance. All right, here I wanted to test out flares and also chromatic aberration again. So let me zoom in. f1.8 here is on the left, top left, and there's barely any chromatic aberration issues. And it also for like flare performance and ghosting, it performs really well. Here again, I want to test out the flare and chromatic aberration performance. Basically I have the sun right here, and then I focused on this tree, and you don't see any chromatic aberration issues in here. Like it looks very clean. But what I can definitely notice is that you get significantly less contrast when shooting at f1.8 compared to f2.2. As you can see here, it looks, there's like less flares and ghosting in this example compared to here. So basically you do get a bit of ghosting and flaring, but it's not that terrible in my opinion. And then here is a video of the flares you get with video. You kind of see this green reddish flare in here. But in terms of like ghosting performance, it performs really well in my personal opinion. All right, and finally, I just want to show you how it performs in terms of like the bokeh and stuff like that. Here is f1.8, wide open. I was relatively close to the subject in here. And as you can see, you definitely get like a vintage, swirly, in a way, bokeh effect. Let me just zoom in. Look at the corners in here. You get some cat eye shaped bokeh on the sides when shooting wide open, which turns into like a circle, if you will, when stopping down to like f2.8. And then here is the other corner. You kind of see how it looks like. Here is a video shot of the bokeh also. So you can kind of see how it looks on video. Here you can clearly see the cat eye shaped bokeh on the sides, which gives the image a bit of character, honestly. And honestly, I think this is it for this video. Hopefully you got enough comparisons and samples to decide whether it's worth buying this lens or not. If it was me, I would probably skip buying this lens because it's a bit bulky, 400 grams, and the size of it for a 1.8 35mm lens is a bit too big for that. The Sony 35mm 1.8 is much smaller and lighter. I also did not like the minimum focus distance number, like the 40 centimeters, and also didn't like how it performs at the minimum focus distance. So I think if you want something better, I would consider either the Viltrox 40mm f2, which is, I believe, is slightly cheaper than this and performs really well. I also reviewed that lens. You can check it out somewhere on my channel. Or even better, you can get the Sony 35mm 1.8 on the second-hand market, which I believe should be somewhat the same price as this lens. This one is $300, so I think the Sony 35mm 1.8 is pretty much the same price on the second-hand market. But that lens is significantly better than this in terms of pretty much everything. It is lighter, smaller, better autofocus performance, better image quality, shorter minimum focus distance, and also better stabilization performance, because when you pair a native Sony lens with a native Sony camera, you get the absolute best stabilization performance. So honestly, I'm not really sure how I feel about this lens, but you let me know down below what you think. And also don't forget to check out the links for this lens if you are interested. And I guess I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.